Thank you, everyone, for being here. Can everyone hear me in the back? All right, good. Well, I'd like to thank Mark Rees for the invitation and to Keith for organizing everything and for the faculty to allow their students to come to this talk. And what I'm going to do is today present to you a lecture or a paper from my ongoing research project. So some of the ideas are hypothetical, are being worked out, but the best way to work them out is in a public setting to see if they make sense to people other than yourself. So the title of the lecture is The Caliph versus the Saint, Sovereignty in Islam in Early Modern Times. And let me begin by saying what I mean by early modern, because I'm using this as a phrase. It's usually sort of used for European history, but I mean here the time period between the 1300s and the 1800s. And something changes also in Islamic history in this period, and I would argue that change is a shift in the nature or style of sovereignty, how kingship and notions of politics worked. So specifically, the political culture of the three largest Muslim empires of this era, the early modern era or the post-Mongol era, that is Timurid, Central Asia, Safavid Iran, and the Ottoman Empire, which was based in the Middle East, cannot be understood without taking into account the significance of saint shrines. If we use imperial engagement with the graves of holy men as a measure, these early modern realms, which were Turkic in ethnic origin and Persianate in court culture, provide a sharp historical contrast to the Umayyad and Abbasid polities of the classical era, when Arab ethnicity, language, and custom were the norm, and when the cults of Muslim saints had yet to take root. And today I may have actually seen a cult of saint in this academy as well, right? The crypt. I mean, the first thing I thought was, I was told that he's been buried so he can always look at the sea. And I said, this must be your patron saint then. Right? Now, from the 10th century to the 13th, across the Muslim world, there was a gradual development of popular shrine cults, which began to receive greater acceptance and patronage by Muslim rulers. But it was only after the Mongol-dominated 13th century that the enshrined saint transformed into an iconic source of sovereignty, replacing in an important sense the sacred body of the Caliph. Now, some of you may be wondering, what is the political use of a saint in a shrine? Well, to answer that question, first let me ask another question. What use is actually a powerless caliph, right? When somebody talks about the caliphate today in Islamic history, it's the Abbasids who come to mind, who rose in the 8th century. But the Abbasids actually lost both doctrinal, that is religious, as well as political authority in the 9th century, towards the end of the 9th century. But the caliphate survived as an institution in Baghdad till the 13th century. Why? Now, generally in scholarship on Islamic history, this is a question that is seldom asked, because scholars lose interest in the caliphate once it loses political and doctrinal authority. If it's just a figurehead, why should we bother studying him, right? Nobody will publish your book, certainly. But I think that by not focusing on that, we've actually missed a key point. In fact, one could argue that the caliphate really becomes a very important institution after it loses its political and doctrinal authority. And the reason for that is, it is in the 10th century that when the Abbasid Empire has broken down, has become fragmented, it's replaced by a bunch of smaller kingdoms, usually ruled by men or by warlords of Turkic origin, who are coming in from Central Asia or Inner Asia into Iran. And the only way that these small rulers, small kings could become proper Muslim sovereigns was through an engagement or a connection with the caliphate. So imagine that you're a tribal leader coming down from Central Asia in the 11th century, and you conquer a large part of Iran. how would you establish yourself as a Muslim sovereign? The only way to do that would be to associate yourself with the Caliph. And the association would be ritual. Your name would be said alongside that of the Caliph in the Friday prayers. That would bond the two together. And the other association would be even more closely related to the Caliph's body. The Caliph would actually put on a robe and then take that robe off. And then you, as the ruler, would put that robe on, right? So essentially, by taking the Caliph's robe and putting it on, you're becoming part of literally the Caliph's body, right? So it was these rituals that made the Caliphate so important, and the demand by these different groups to try to participate in the sovereignty of the Caliphate. And in fact, the ritual and iconic value of the Caliphate grew in this period. In the earlier period, the Caliph was addressed as an ordinary man. But in this period, from the 10th and 11th century onwards, we begin to see very elaborate rituals of veneration of the Caliphate. So then the question becomes, in the 13th century, when the Mongols come in and they're non-Muslims, they follow their own religion, they destroy the Caliphate, what is going to happen? Right? This whole system, which was based on participating in the caliphal notions of sovereignty, is going to disappear. And I would argue that it was replaced by the enshrined saint. So here is a map, because we'll be going all over the Islamic world in this lecture, but focusing mainly on Iran and sometime and Central Asia, but some in South Asia as well. And the three empires that I talked about were the Safavids, which ruled over Iran from 16th century onwards. The Timurids or Timurids were also known as the Mughals of India, who were originally based in Central Asia, but then established themselves in South Asia. And then, of course, the more well-known Ottomans, who I'm going to touch upon towards the end. So to understand the rise of shrines, we must begin much earlier than the Timurid or Mongol era. For many of the earliest important saint shrines of Islam were of the Alids, that is, descendants of the Prophet. And these first gained popularity in the 8th and 9th centuries under the Abbasids. But since this caliphal dynasty felt threatened by the Alids, in whose name rebels frequently rose against them, the Abbasids' initial concern was to destroy places devoted to preserving the veneration of Ali. But over time, Alid shrines became more popular than the Abbasids. So much so that the Abbasid caliphs not only patronized them, but also mimicked them for their own burial practices. Thus, by the 11th century, domed shrines of all types had become part of Islamic architecture. This led to an important transformation of the religious landscape. Before, key pilgrimage centers had been the graves of pre-Islamic prophets. Now the shrines of Alid and increasingly Sufi saints drew more visitors. It would not be wrong to say that Muslim saint shrines were the sites that enabled a shift from a biblical to an Islamic landscape. This transformation was largely complete by the 12th century, when once again Sunni dynasties gained power. And it is really by the 11th, 12th century that we actually have a hard doctrinal divide developing between a Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, which wasn't the case in the 9th century. Now, the new Sunni rulers faced a problem when patronizing Alid graves. They had to acknowledge the importance of these sites, which were very popular, but they also had to patronize them in a way that set them apart from their predecessors, which had been Shi'i rulers. They solved this problem by marking their patronage of Alid shrines with the breaking of a Shi'i taboo. For instance, the Ayyubids, Saladin, the famous Saladin who fought the Crusaders, the Ayyubids are named after him. It was in Syria that Saladin's son patronized an Alid shrine, in fact a series of Alid shrines, but did so by inscribing prayers for the companions of the Prophet on these shrines. Now, as is well known, most Shi'is avoided such prayers for the companions, many of whom had been rivals of Ali. Some preferred to curse the companions, the extremist Shi'is publicly so. Thus, by inscribing a prayer for the companions, Sunni elites could patronize the shrine and participate in the charisma of the Alid saint, but without entering the Shi'i sectarian fold. And this is an important point, right? How do you patronize, how do you embrace a popular saint shrine but not declare yourself part of a particular sectarian community, right? So this is the model that they come up with. And what is interesting is that this model is actually spreads quite widely. And although the Ayyubids were in Syria, right here, and were patronizing Alid shrines here, we actually see something similar happen far to the northeast of Iran in a place called Mashhad. And Mashhad is where the 8th Shi'i Imam is buried, and today has become the most important shrine of Iran, right? Now, it is in Mashhad that we see an inscription praising the companions of the Prophet inscribed in the early 13th century. And this inscription is from the reign of a ruler called Khwarazm Shah. He was a mighty Central Asian ruler who was laid low by Chinggis Khan in the early 13th century. From art historical studies, it appears that Khwarazm Shah commissioned a massive rebuilding of the Mashhad shrine at a time of intense political rivalry between him and the reigning Abbasid Caliph Nasser. Now remember, we talked about what was the relationship between the sultans and the caliph, right? The sultan wanted recognition from the caliph. The caliph didn't really have political authority. But Caliph Nasser begins to actually work towards developing his own political authority. And in doing so, he's trying to put down the Turkic rulers of the time. Now, the Caliph refused to recognize the Khwarazm Shah as a sovereign despite his victories in Iran. This angered the Shah, who decided to march on Baghdad. If it had not been for heavy snow in the west and the threat of Chinggis Khan from the east, Khwarazm Shah may have brought the Abbasid Caliphal house to an end. This much is well known. What is less so is that when his battle plan did not work, Khwarazm Shah came up with a ritual one. He declared the Abbasid Caliph dead and installed in his place an Alid as Caliph, whose name was pronounced in the Friday congregational prayers across eastern Iran and Transoxania. For a very brief moment in the early 13th century, the rivalry between Khwarazm Shah and the Abbasid Caliph produced an Alid counter-caliphate. Now I said Alid, I didn't say Shi'i. And we'll see why. Because it is perhaps this rivalry that we see reflected in Khwarazm Shah's massive rebuilding of Imam Riza's shrine. The Alid who had been appointed a caliph was of little import, especially in competition with the established Abbasid line. The greatest son of Ali in the land was actually Imam Riza, whose shrine had steadily grown in size and significance since the 9th century. In an important sense, Khwarazm Shah's patronage of Mashhad was part of his scheme to derive his sovereignty not from the Sunni Abbasid Caliph, but from the enshrined saint buried at Mashhad. And the prayer for the companions on the Imam's shrine was a way for him to display his loyalty to Ali without embracing doctrinal Shiism, right? So what I'm saying is Khwarazm Shah does exactly what the same thing in Mashhad, what the Ayyubids had been doing in Syria, which is appropriating Ali saint shrines, but not becoming Shi'i. This attitude was quite pervasive in the beginning of the 13th century. Caliph Nasser himself provides a good example with his embrace of Ali symbols and a specific organization called the Futuwa, which was sort of like a Sufi fraternity that he used to bind his subjects to himself. But while the Caliphate and Nasser's Futuwa schemes did not survive the Mongol onslaught, the saint shrine did. The Mongol kings, when they became Muslim, even elaborated on these sacred spaces, right? So the Mongols invade Iran and Central Asia from Inner Asia, and they don't embrace Islam for, depending on how you see it, for 50 to 100 years in different parts. But eventually, when they begin converting to Islam, they essentially do it by an embrace of the various important saint shrines of the region. And in doing so, they even elaborated on these sacred spaces and introduced new rituals. One such new institution was the Darus Siyada, or the House of the Prophet's Kin. This was invented by the first Mongol Muslim ruler, Ghazan Khan, who converted to Islam. And it was a hospice designed to serve essentially the elites, the Alids, or descendants of the Prophet. By creating such a hospice in every major city of the Ilkhanid realm, the Mongol ruler attempted to align his Chinggizid lineage, which was pagan, with the prophetic line of Islam. In the following centuries, we see Darus Siyadas, or house, these endowed hospices, added to various Alid and Sufi shrines. Overall, the importance of saint shrines rose markedly for Muslim kingship in the post-Mongol milieus. This was in part because of the end of the caliphate. When the caliph could no longer serve as the sacred icon of sovereignty, a body from whom Muslim amirs, sultans, and shahs used to derive their sovereignty, this created a demand that was met by the enshrined saint, who became in this era the real sovereign. Right? It is no accident that it was in Timurid times, which is 15th century, that Imam Reza was called the Sultan of Khorasan, that is, the true ruler of the realm who ruled the region from his shrine in Mashhad. So with this background in mind, let me turn to two specific cases involving kings and shrines in the late Timurid and early Safavid era, which is the 16th century. One concerns the Safavid destruction of the shrine of the Naqshbandi poet Jami in Herat, which is in modern-day Afghanistan, and the other, the pilgrimage of the Timurid ruler Humayun to the Alid shrines at Ardabil and Mashhad. But before we do that, let me briefly tell you what the Safavid dynasty, which conquered Iran in the 16th century, did to saint shrines. We know that the Safavid policy of imposing Shiism, and it is the Safavids, some of you may have been learning in your history class, who converted Islam to Shiism. That process had a major impact on shrines of the region. Now, Iran used to be the homeland of Sufism and was full of saint shrines. What happened to them? Well, first of all, the Safavids converted their own shrine. They were a Sufi family. And their predecessor, Sheikh Safiuddin, after whom they are named, right? Safavid come from Safi, into that of an Alid saint. He was given a genealogy connecting him to the Prophet. So what had been a Sufi shrine now began to function like that of an Imam Zadeh, or shrine of a descendant of the Alid Imam. Within a generation, the Safavids also embraced Mashhad, right, in northwestern Iran, and began to treat it as a second dynastic shrine. And it's important to see the geographic range of this, right? So they rose out of Ardabil. This was where the dynastic shrine was. They conquered all of Iran, and then they embraced Mashhad as a second dynastic shrine. Both Mashhad and Ardabil began to serve as burial places for the Safavid royal family. The level of their involvement with Mashhad can be gauged by the fact that under the Safavids, the state took over the administration of Imam Reza's shrine, an unprecedented step in the history of Mashhad or any other major shrine of Iran, as far as I know. Previously, rulers used to patronize shrines by giving money or endowments, but wouldn't actually run the shrine directly. But that's what the Safavids started doing. But since the Safavids were no longer willing to remain ambiguous in their commitment to the family of Ali, they actually openly declared Shiism. They rolled back the customs that Sunni powers had used to link their sovereignty with Ali shrines. Right? Sunni powers would inscribe prayers to for the companions, Prophet's companions. Safavids, in fact, stopped doing that. They went a step further and imposed their own rights of conquest on non-Alid shrines. And this is what happened at Jami's mausoleum in Herat, which was destroyed by the invading Safavid forces. Now, this is an important point, which is today when you hear about attacks on saint shrines in the Muslim world, usually those are acts of iconoclasm, which is people attacking these saint shrines believe that those saints, the veneration of saints is forbidden, right? So they're destroying something that they think is heretical. But that is not the case here. In this case, attacks on saint shrines are coming from groups who venerate their own saints, right? So this isn't iconoclastic in that sense. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. Now, the eyewitness account of the destruction of the Sufi shrine in Herat of the Naqshbandi saint Jami is in the work of a minor Herati poet and writer, Zainuddin Wasafi. The account is unique because we don't really get that many eyewitness descriptions. But Wasafi provides a detailed description of the Safavid rights of sovereignty, especially the reading of the victory proclamation or the Fathnama that the Safavids enacted after they had conquered the region. Wasafi wrote that when in 1510 the Safavid Shah Ismail had defeated his rival Uzbek king to become the ruler of the region, he did not enter Herat himself but sent one of his agents to organize the reading of the victory proclamation. The Safavid agent gathered Herat's notables in the congregational mosque. Many commoners were also present, some even on the roof. At first, a quarrel ensued among two eager scions of Sayyid families or Alid families of Herat about who would recite the victory proclamation. And this was written in very elaborate language and was going to be, the person who would recite would be rewarded with trays of gold and things like that. However, the person who won the privilege ended up losing his life. This was because neither he nor anyone else had realized that the ceremony required the public cursing of the companions of the Prophet. So Safavids were now reversing the policy of what the Sunni rulers used to do. Sunni rulers would inscribe prayers for the companions of the Prophet, and the Safavids were now requiring a ritual cursing, right? And when the reciter hesitated, the Safavid ruler hacked him to death. The Safavid soldiers hacked him to death at the foot of the pulpit. Now, this was not the only incident about ritual cursing in Wasafi's account. In fact, he had started his anecdote with the story of a close friend who, 15 years earlier, had a street preacher caught and hanged for cursing the companions of the Prophet. Wasafi had warned his friend even then that Shah Ismail had risen in Iraq and that many in Herat were his sympathizers, but his friend was too zealous a Sunni to let such an insult pass. This brings me to the second aspect I want to highlight about Wasafi's narrative, which is the sense it gives of the deep but hidden sectarian divide among Herat's population. This is important because Iran was not yet a Shia majority region, but was going to, under the Safavids, convert to Shiism. But there was already this hidden divide among the population, but it was hard to tell who was on which side. And Wasafi emphasizes this issue again when he describes what happened after the victory proclamation incident. When the Safavids saw that the Herati elite was hesitant about cursing the companions, they marched as many people as they could on pain of death to the shrine of Jami and made them watch as they burnt it to the ground. As Wasafi stood there, bearing witness to the flames, he recognized the man standing next to him as a reliable Sunni from his school days and suggested to him that they both quietly slip away. To his surprise, the man turned out to be a Shia, who called out to the Safavid soldiers to arrest Wasafi. The matter didn't end there. As Wasafi ran for his life, he was given shelter by a woman who hid him in her storeroom. But even she warned him that her husband was a staunch Shia and would kill Wasafi if he found him. What Wasafi's story shows is that in Timurid Herat, at the beginning of the 16th century, one did not know for certain the sectarian loyalty of an old school friend or even one's wife. With the Safavid conquest, however, this confusion began to clear up, and in the process, the shrines of Iran began to be marked either as Sunni or Shi'i. But why did the Safavids choose to target the shrine of Jami? After all, they were themselves a Sufi family. Contemporary sources are not helpful in answering this question, except in the very general sense of Shah Ismail's animosity towards Sunnis and rival Sufis. But based on Wasafi's narrative, I suspect that Jami's shrine was targeted because this famous Naqshbandi Sufi had been closely associated with the city's last Timurid ruler, Hussain Baikara, and his administration. The Sufi also had a reputation for harboring anti-Shi'i sentiments. The last Timurid ruler, however, had died a few years ago, and the Uzbek invasion had dislodged his sons as rulers of the region. When the Safavids entered Herat after defeating the Uzbeks, the city was in effect kingless. Can we assume then that the enshrined saint stood in for Herat's missing sovereign? If so, one could argue that since the Safavids did not have a king to subjugate, they subjugated the saint associated with him. In any case, the desecration of Jami's grave was a severe blow to whatever was left of Timurid prestige. Perhaps this is why the incident is not mentioned in any of the later Timurid texts, including the Baburnama, which is the memoir of Babur, who founded the Mughal Empire in India, or in the accounts relating Babur's son Humayun's exile in Iran, which is what I'm going to discuss next. So, very quickly, I'm going to talk now about the Timurids. The Timurids, as I mentioned earlier, originally situated here. They were pushed out by the Uzbeks. They eventually end up in Kabul, then they end up in India. But in India too, they took some time before they settled down. And there was this moment when the second ruler, Humayun, was kicked out by rival Afghans, and he actually had to seek refuge in Iran. He came without an army, without followers, without any treasures, and it was the Safavids who ended up helping him get his kingdom back. But when Humayun first sought refuge and support from the Safavids of Iran, it is significant that his stay there was punctuated by visits to saint shrines. And I want to sort of look at that pattern. At first, he went to Herat, which I've discussed was part of the Timurid heritage, where he is said to have visited a number of saint shrines, but none of the accounts mention the shrine of Jami, which was burnt down. From Herat, Humayun wrote to the Safavid ruler for permission to visit Mashhad. This is important for two reasons. Humayun had not yet met the Safavid king, and the only time he sought imperial permission to visit saint shrines was when he went to Mashhad and later to Ardabil, which are the two places that had the Safavid dynastic shrines. In effect, the Timurid ruler was preparing for his meeting with Tahmasp by first paying Tahmasp, who was the king of Iran, by first paying homage to the Safavid imperial shrine. Right? So you had to go to the patron saint first and then to meet the king. There are several accounts of Humayun's stay at Mashhad, some short, some more detailed. Let me give you the highlights. When the Timurid ruler first entered the tomb, he burst into tears. Altogether, he spent 30-40 days there meditating, venerating the saint, accompanied by the prominent alids of the city. And before leaving, he hung his bow at the shrine's gate as a votive offering so that he could actually get his wish. Finally, it was in Mashhad that Humayun received summons from the Safavid Shah. Now, when Humayun reached the Safavid court, the ruler immediately made him submit by putting on what was called the Safavid Taj, or the Safavid crown. Now, this ceremony was very significant because the Safavids, although they were kings, they maintained their Sufi saintly rituals of discipleship, which is if you became a courtier at the Iranian court, at the Safavid court, you had to also accept discipleship. You had to accept that you were treating the king as your spiritual guide or leader. And the mark of being a disciple was you would be given a specific hat to wear. It was a long, thin hat wrapped around by a turban. And since it was red and it would make you look like you had a red head, that was the term used for the Safavid followers, Kizilbash, which in Turkish means redhead. So when the Timurid ruler shows up at court, the first thing he's made to take off his headgear, and he's put on the Taj of a disciple. So it was an initiation ceremony, right? Sort of, in some ways, a rite of passage. And he submits. He doesn't have a choice. But after some difficult moments with the king, Humayun eventually managed to extract promises of military support. But then he felt that the king's attitude had changed. It is at this time that Humayun left for Ardabil, which was even further away from India, right? And the shrine of the Safavid ancestor Sheikh Safiuddin. This move apparently served him well, because upon Humayun's return from Ardabil, Shah Tahmasp finally gave him the soldiers he had asked for, some 12,000 men. What is clear is that Humayun's supplication and submission to the Safavids involved Sufi rituals, rituals of sainthood, and it involved a pilgrimage to their imperial shrines. And Humayun played his part as a Safavid disciple or devotee well. According to one account, when he was facing a difficult moment with the Safavid Shah, Humayun even asked for help by invoking the king's father, Shah Ismail, who was buried in the shrine of Ardabil, right? So he invoked him as a patron saint, saying he will solve my problem. This act, amongst others, shows how these shrines and their saints had become substitutes for the court and the king. In all, what I'm suggesting here is that Humayun's pilgrimage to Ardabil and Mashhad were part of the same dynamic, the substitution of the saint for the king, that existed, I think, in the case of the destruction of Jami's shrine in Herat. Now, it is important to point out that Safavids were not just the perpetrators of such ritual violence. They also saw their own shrines being attacked and desecrated. As I mentioned earlier, under them the shrine of Imam Reza was brought for the first time under direct state control, which appointed its officials, oversaw its endowments and accounts, and reserved its patronage for the monarch. The second Safavid ruler, Shah Tahmasp, had the dome gilded and topped with a gold spike. He donated gold and silver chandeliers and created a hall for the descendants of the Prophet, a Darus Siyada, right? The institution I mentioned that arose in post-Mongol times. Most significant was the Safavid use of the Mashhad shrine for holding imperial court and for burying emperors. Such acts merged together Safavid sovereignty with that of the enshrined saint. However, this also meant that when Mashhad was taken by the Uzbeks, the shrine of Imam Reza, which was an icon of Safavid sovereignty, became a prime target. Now, the Uzbeks were Sunnis who also venerated the Imam and dared not desecrate his grave, but they could loot and undo the Safavid patronage of the shrine. In Uzbek attacks on Mashhad in the 16th century, the gold spike was taken from the dome. The gold and silver chandeliers were stolen. Jewels from the treasury were used to adorn the Uzbek throne. Buildings endowed by the Safavids around the shrine's courtyard were destroyed, and the bodies of Safavid rulers were dug up. And the Safavid appointed caretakers of the shrines were slaughtered. So, again, these were ritual acts that were aimed at destroying the connection between the saint's charisma and the Safavid dynastic line, right? Now, we may ask, how did all of this shape the Timurids' experience in India, right? And the Timurids founded the empire that now we more commonly call the Mughal Empire, but the Timurids never called themselves Mughals. It's a later designation. So, first of all, it seems to me that the Safavid model of an imperial shrine directly managed by the empire and closely linked to the body of the emperor was replicated in India by Humayun's son Akbar at a place called Ajmer. And this is India, and where is Ajmer? It's right here, right? So, initially the Ajmer shrine had been little more than a mud grave when the Chishti saint, a migrant from Chisht in Khorasan or Afghanistan, was buried there in the 13th century. There were few Muslims and the ruler was Hindu of this area. The frontier circumstances of the Chishti grave were similar to those surrounding the grave of Imam Reza in the 8th century. In its first 200 years, the Ajmer grave acquired a cenotaph and little else, but it began to draw the interest of kings. And this happened because the Chishti Sufi order over the 13th, 14th century began to grow in India. And as the Sufi order began to grow, its shrines began to grow in importance as well. So that is why it drew the interest of kings. And from the 1300s to 1500s, we begin to see a series of minor kings of Gujarat, of Malwa. Even Hindu kings began to visit the shrine and try to occupy it, try to associate it with their rule. And as they did it, the shrine grew in size. As the shrine grew in size, more pilgrims came to the shrine, which again attracted more rulers. So it was this process that actually raised the value of the shrine. Now, by the time the Timurids arrived, the Chishti saint was already a regional icon of sovereignty over which Hindu and Muslim rulers competed. A late 16th century text from India, which is a Chishti text, a Sufi biography of Sufi saints, recorded that when the Raja of Jodhpur conquered Ajmer, he was a Hindu king, he converted the shrine into a temple and placed Hindu idols over the saint's tomb. The Muslim shrine served for a while thus as a royal temple. However, when a prince of Gujarat who saw this said, when I become king, I'm going to come and undo this and reappropriate the shrines for Islam. And that's exactly what he did. When he conquered Gujarat, he came back and made good on his vow. So again, you begin to see kings are now vowing to saints, and that actually increases the value of the saint shrine. However, the Ajmer shrine had not become exclusively linked to a dynasty or empire until the Mughal Emperor Akbar, Humayun's son, did so. Much as the Safavids had done with Mashhad, Akbar made the enshrined Chishti saint at Ajmer the key patron saint of the empire and directly appointed the shrine's caretakers. That this was an exclusive relationship between the emperor and the saint can be seen in the way the emperor reserved for himself the privilege of patronizing the annual shrine festival. It is highly plausible that Humayun's experience at the imperial shrines of Safavid Iran may have influenced this development. However, despite the similarity between Safavid and Mughal attitude towards shrines, they developed important differences. For one, in India, the Mughals did not use the Ajmer shrine as an imperial mausoleum. They built instead grand tomb shrines for themselves on a scale that had no precedent. This is why we have the Taj Mahal in India. The Safavids would bury themselves in their dynastic shrines, saint shrines. But the Mughals said, no, we're going to build a mausoleum for every emperor. And this happened because the Mughals eventually began to claim that they were more sacred than the saints, right? So the saintliness the style of kingship that the Mughals developed had a slightly different trajectory in India. But I would like to conclude by offering some comparisons of the above with the Ottoman experience of shrines. When scholars of the Ottoman Empire compare the Ottoman attitude toward the cults of Muslim saints with the Safavid, Uzbek, and Timurid ones, they express surprise at the extreme nature of the latter cases, that is, the cases in Iran and India. One scholar says that the Ottoman rulers would have never stooped to call themselves servants of buried holy men, conduct long pilgrimages on foot to their graves, or sweep the courtyards of their shrines, which is what rulers in Iran and India did with their patron saints. These excessively devotional customs, in the scholar's opinion, are the result of the Mongol legacy, which privileged shrine cults over other forms of Islam. Perhaps so. This certainly seems to be the case, but I would also like to point out that when seen from the east, it is the Ottomans who appear to be the odd ones out. They are the ones who do not develop imperial shrines and are left out of the saint-centered model of kingship that swept across Muslim Asia after the Mongols. The common explanation why is that the Ottomans shied away from shrine-centered Sufism because of their enmity and competition with the Safavids, which was, again, a Sufi-based dynasty. This may well be the case, but I think it needs to be worked out in detail and not assumed too easily. Now, a recent book, that of the art historian Zainab Yurekli, is actually very helpful here. And she offers a much-needed corrective to Ottoman art history and history, which has been focused on mosques and palaces and has neglected shrine complexes. So, Yurekli reconstructed the history of the shrines, of two Ottoman-era shrines, Sayyid Ghazi and Haji Bektash, which were really in Anatolia. And now, of course, we are in Anatolia, which is this region. And unfortunately, I don't have the cities marked here. But that was sort of the heartland of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. It was in the late 15th century, at the same time that the Safavids were gathering strength in northwestern Iran, that both these shrines were built on a massive scale and became elaborated multifunctional complexes, not unlike the development of the Mashhad shrine under the Timurids. Yurekli also notes that the palatial layout and appearance of these reconstructed shrines evoked Ottoman imperial palaces in Istanbul or Edirne, which means that whoever would visit these reconstructed shrine complexes would feel that they had arrived at a royal building, right? So the power of these saints reflected sort of the rebuilding of those shrines, that as if they were sources of sovereignty. Now, the Ottomans did not directly patronize these shrines, and that's the important difference. They did not; these saints did not serve as patron saints of the Ottoman dynasty. They were actually patronized by vassals of the Ottomans, but the Ottomans did interfere in the administration of these shrines. And they usually did that to control their vassals and punish them. For example, they interrupted the construction of one shrine for 3 decades and closed that shrine after a rebellion, right? So if your vassals rise up against you, you go and you do something to their patron saint, right? So as a warning. The Ottomans did patronize other shrines. Let me just give you a quick list. In 1453, after their conquest of Constantinople, built the shrine of Abu Ayyub Ansari. In 1517, after the conquest of Egypt and Syria, they built the shrine of Ibn Arabi in Damascus. And upon the conquest of Baghdad, they built the shrine, they renovated the shrine of a very famous Sufi sheikh called Abdul Qadir Gilani. All of these acts of patronage followed, as I mentioned, acts of conquest. So you conquer a region and you then thank the local saint for victory. The one case of extensive and continued Ottoman patronage of a saint shrine that did not involve conquest was that of the famous Sufi poet Rumi in Konya. A series of Ottoman emperors contributed to the growth of this shrine, which acted as a counterweight to the Sayyid Ghazi and Bektashi shrines in Anatolia, right? So they did try to come up with counterweights to the shrines that their vassals had. And one argument is that this may have actually led to a partial realignment of the Janissary military corps, which was their crack slave infantry soldiers who used to follow the Bektashi cult, saint cult. They were sort of encouraged to move more towards following Rumi, or the Sufi order that followed Rumi, which was the Mevlevi one. Now, the most important difference concerning imperial patronage of shrines between the Ottoman case and the Mughals, Uzbek, and Safavid situation seems to have been the official use of the juridical fatwa, which was that the Ottomans would usually patronize a saint shrine by first getting a legal opinion or legal response from their court scholars. Now, whether the Ottomans needed the jurist support or whether they used the official fatwas to highlight their difference from the Safavids or other followers of these saints is a question that I think needs to be examined. But there is no denying that the Ottomans also made a very serious engagement with saint shrines, and I think that was part of the same legacy that they inherited as the other empires did in the post-Mongol world. So with that, I'd like to end, and thank you for listening.
Can you take a few questions?
Sure.
Okay, I think Dr. Moin will take a couple of questions. If anyone has a question to start off with, I could sneak a question in, but I will let the midshipmen start with a question. No questions yet. Okay, well, as you're thinking about this, I wonder if Dr. Moin, if you could reflect on, it's a wonderful discussion you've done about the politics of early modern saint shrines in this region. It's a very political thing. I wonder if you could reflect on the 20th and 21st century politics of these shrines, and are there any comparisons and contrasts? You mentioned the contrast of people who don't want any shrines, of course, and maybe reflect on that a little bit, if that's possible.
Sure. Of course, I mean, there's this model of thinking about saint shrines as a source of sovereignty begins to end in the 18th century as these empires disappear. And in some ways that we've forgotten how this model worked, and that's why historians haven't really paid much attention to it. What happens after the 18th century is essentially we get a wave of what historians call reform movements, which begin to argue that shrine veneration is against Islam. When the first time this is argued in the 18th century, it's actually considered heretical because, of course, you're arguing against a dominant practice. But slowly, as the empires disappear, these saint shrines lost patronage, imperial patronage, and they could be criticized. So the reformists actually won over the 19th and 20th century. And now, when we see saint shrines attacked, it's usually always the case that they're attacked as a sign of heresy, of innovation, and the opposite cannot be reconstructed, which is shrines can no longer be used to make universal claims of sovereignty. I think that model just doesn't exist in the 20th century.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Or okay. Anyone? Question? All right. Well, let's give a big thanks, a round of applause. And a small, very small token of our appreciation. Do you want to?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. A wonderful illustrator, which includes our patron saint shrine photograph, certainly, within it. So, again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Okay.